The night was as black as pitch, the kind of storm that swallowed every horizon and turned the earth itself into a mire of mud and water. Rain hammered the plains in a merciless rhythm, pelting down so hard it blurred the line between sky and ground. The wagon had given way hours earlier, one wheel snapping clean off in the deep rut of the trail. The horse had gone down not long after, its chest heaving in agony before collapsing into stillness. Anna May Carter had no choice but to pull her children from the wreckage, clutching Eli's small hand in her right and holding Ruthie tight against her hip with the other. They had walked until their legs trembled and their bodies could bear no more. Now they huddled at the side of the trail, rain sluicing down their faces, their clothing plastered to their skin, the mud sucking at their bare feet, like it meant to keep them buried. Anna bent low, her arms wrapping around both children as she tried to shield them. Her shawl was soaked through, useless against the wind that cut sharp as a knife, but still she pressed it around them. Eli's teeth chattered in violent rhythm, and little Ruthie sobbed weakly, too cold to cry for long. Anna whispered comfort she did not believe in, words stolen by the wind before they even reached the children's ears. Her eyes strained against the darkness, hoping for any light, any landmark that might mean shelter. But the land was empty, a vast and unforgiving wilderness, and every step felt like one more into a grave dug by the storm itself. The road to the town was still miles ahead. She knew it. She felt it in her bones. The weight of it pressed down harder than the rain, harder than the mud that clung to her skirts. Hope was slipping from her fingers like water she couldn't hold. She had begun to wonder if this was how their journey would end, in silence, in cold, in the endless dark of a prairie storm, when a figure stumbled into view. At first, it was only a shape in the distance, blurred by the sheets of rain. Anna thought her eyes deceived her, some shadow cast by lightning. But as it drew closer, the figure grew more defined. A man swaying heavily, his boots dragging through the muck, one hand clutching at the trail as if to steady himself against the earth. He reeked of whiskey even before he was close enough for his face to be seen, and the way he moved spoke of a man who'd emptied more bottles than days he'd worked. Jesse Coulter had been called many things in town: cowhand, brawler, useless drunk, and most of them he had earned. His hat was crooked, his coat half open to the storm, and his eyes shone glassy under the dim flashes of lightning. Yet when they fell on Anna and her children crouched in the mud, something flickered there, faint but undeniable. Anna straightened, pulling Eli and Ruthie closer, her body tense as a bowstring. She did not know this man, but she knew enough about men who staggered home from saloons in the dead of night. They could bring more danger than salvation. Still, the shadow of him was all the storm had given, and he loomed above them now, swaying, squinting against the rain. "What in God's name?" Jesse's voice slurred, but it carried through the thunder. "You'll die out here." Anna's lips trembled, but her voice was steady. "We just might," she said, holding her children closer. Jesse blinked at them through the rain, then at the wreck of the wagon in the distance, the carcass of the horse lying still against the mud. He swayed once more, nearly fell, then braced himself against the storm. For a moment, he looked as if he might walk on, as if their misery was too heavy for his unsteady shoulders. But then Ruthie's small cry cut through the storm, a fragile, broken sound, and Jesse froze. His whiskey-clouded mind faltered, and something old, long buried under years of drink, stirred within him. With a grunt, he extended a hand, his voice rough but steady this time. "There's a shack yonder," he said, nodding into the darkness. "Ain't much, but it's walls and a roof. You'll not last the night out here." Anna looked at the stranger's hand, then at her children. Trusting a drunk cowboy felt near as dangerous as the storm itself. But the rain was still falling, the wind still cutting, and her children's small bodies were still shaking against her. She had no choice. With every ounce of strength left in her, Anna May Carter rose, took Jesse Coulter's hand, and followed him into the dark. Jesse Coulter staggered along the trail, the storm wrapping around him like a punishment he half believed he deserved. His boots, caked in mud, sank deep into the ruts carved by wagon wheels, every step a battle between gravity and whiskey. The rain soaked him through, plastering his shirt to his chest, dripping from the brim of a hat that had long since lost its shape. He had wandered out of town after too many bottles, his fist still aching from a fight he could barely remember. Somewhere behind him, the saloon lights had faded into the dark, and ahead was nothing but endless prairie. It didn't matter. He had been walking nowhere for years. The people in town called him a lost cause. They said he had once been good with a horse, quick with a gun, strong in the saddle, but all of that had rotted away under the weight of whiskey. They laughed when he passed, or else ignored him entirely. He had let it happen too. Easier to play the fool than try and fail to be the man he once was. Every coin he earned at odd jobs melted into liquor before the day was through. Every fight he picked ended the same way, flat on his back in the dirt, staring up at the stars he could no longer reach. Tonight was no different, until he stumbled on them. At first he thought the storm was conjuring ghosts, his mind playing tricks the way it did after too much drink. A woman crouched in the mud, arms stretched around two children, their small forms pressed close to her in a vain attempt at warmth. The wagon lay broken in the road behind them, the horse a dark shape sprawled in the muck. Lightning cracked overhead, and for a second the whole scene was carved sharp into his vision. The mother's hollow eyes, the boy's clenched jaw as if he could hold back the cold, the little girl's lips trembling as she whimpered into her mother's shoulder. Jesse stopped dead, swaying on his feet. He wanted to laugh, or curse, or turn back to town and bury the sight in another bottle. What business was it of his if some poor family froze to death in the storm? He was no savior. He was barely a man anymore, yet he couldn't move. Something rooted him to the mud, something he hadn't felt in so long he almost didn't recognize it. The look in those children's eyes pierced through the fog of whiskey like a blade. Terror, yes, but also trust blind, desperate trust that someone, anyone, might help them. For years, Jesse had carried the weight of his own failures like a saddle too heavy to set down. He had lost his family before they even had a chance to begin, a wife and child gone to fever and childbirth. He had drowned himself in liquor to stop hearing their voices in his dreams. But now, staring at this woman and her children, he felt the sharp, stinging memory of what it meant to be needed. It clawed at him, uncomfortable and unfamiliar, a responsibility he had thought buried beneath years of drink. His throat tightened, and he muttered to himself, "God help me." He swiped rain from his face with a shaking hand, though it did nothing. The woman lifted her head then, her eyes full of suspicion and fear, but too tired to resist when he crouched clumsily before them. "There's a shack," he said, the words thick but steady enough. "Just a mile from here. Ain't much, but it'll keep the rain off." The boy narrowed his eyes at him, protective despite his age, but the girl clung tighter to her mother's dress. Jesse swallowed, something in his chest twisting. He had no right to speak to them, no right to offer help when he could barely keep himself standing. And yet, as the thunder rolled and the rain came down harder, he knew he couldn't walk away. For the first time in years, Jesse Coulter felt a spark in the ash heap of his life, the sting of responsibility, sharp and unrelenting. Whether he wanted it or not, it bound him to these strangers in the storm. The shack squatted at the edge of a wind-bent grove, half lost to the prairie as if even the land wanted to forget it. Its roof sagged, shingles missing in jagged gaps that let the rain pour through. The door hung crooked, one hinge long since rusted away, and every gust of wind made it slam and shudder like a coffin lid. Jesse pushed it open with his shoulder and motioned Anna May inside. She hesitated only a heartbeat before shepherding Eli and Ruthie through, their small feet dragging, skirts heavy with mud. Jesse followed last, steadying himself against the warped frame, his breath clouding in the icy air that rushed through the cracks in the walls. It was no home, barely a shelter at all. The wind howled through broken planks, and water ran down the inside walls in thin rivulets. The place smelled of dust, rot, and old straw. Still, compared to the fury of the storm outside, it offered at least a shadow of protection. Anna guided the children into a corner, pressing their shivering bodies close against her own. Her eyes flicked to Jesse, sharp with doubt. Was this stumbling drunk the best chance they had? Jesse ignored the look. His hands shook as he knelt by the stone hearth, its chimney cracked but still intact. He pawed through the shadows, finding a few splinters of dry wood stacked years ago by some forgotten ranch hand. He piled them with trembling care, then struck flint against steel. The sparks landed cold and useless on the damp kindling. Again and again he tried, muttering curses under his breath, his shoulders trembling with more than the chill. Each failure seemed to confirm the woman's fear that he was nothing but a useless drunk who had led them to 4 rotten walls and nothing more. Behind him, the boy's coughing started low and rough, scraping through the silence. Ruthie whimpered weakly, her voice no stronger than the wind seeping through the cracks. Anna's eyes never left Jessie, her disbelief plain. She wanted to snatch her children up and flee back into the storm rather than watch them waste away in this ruin. He felt the weight of her judgment pressing on him like stones, heavier with every failed strike. Desperation clawed at Jesse. He yanked the knife from his belt, sawed a strip from his own shirt, and without hesitation soaked it with the one thing he had in abundance: whiskey. The liquor stung his nose, sharp and bitter, a smell that had ruled his life for too long. He stuffed the rag into the pile and struck again. This time the sparks bit. The soaked cloth hissed, caught, then bloomed into flame, small and wavering but alive. Jesse shielded it with his hands, coaxing the fragile light into the wood until a true fire crackled to life. Orange glow flickered across the walls, pushing back the storm's darkness. The shack filled with fragile warmth, smoke curling toward the broken rafters. Anna pulled the children close to the fire, stretching their small hands to the heat. Their trembling eased, though their eyes remained wide and uncertain. Jesse sank back on his heels, sweat and rain mixing on his face. For the first time in years, he had done something that mattered not for himself, but for others. The woman still looked at him with doubt, but also with something else, something quieter. In the glow of that fragile fire, Jesse Coulter felt the faintest stirrings of redemption, though he dared not name it yet. The storm finally broke with the gray wash of dawn, but the cold it left behind clung to the land like a sickness. Inside the shack, the fire had burned down to a few glowing embers, the air heavy with damp smoke. Anna May sat against the wall, her shawl spread over Eli and Ruthie, but their bodies still trembled against her. Their lips were cracked and pale, their faces drawn with fever and hunger. Ruthie whimpered faintly in her sleep, the sound breaking Anna's already frayed nerves. She pressed her hand to the girl's forehead, felt the heat burning through her skin, and fought down the rising panic. Jesse stirred near the hearth, stiff and sore from the hard floor. His head pounded with the dull ache of drink and sleeplessness, but the sound of the child's cough snapped him into clarity, sharper than any hangover ever had. He pushed himself up slowly, rubbing his hands over his face, and looked at the 3 huddled figures in the corner. Something in the sight of them, the mother's hollowed eyes, the boy's 2 thin arms wrapped protectively around his sister, struck him deeper than he cared to admit. Without a word, Jesse rose and pulled his coat tight against the chill. He stepped out into the wet morning, the prairie stretching wide and washed clean by the night's storm. The ground was sodden, puddles reflecting the pale light. He moved with a steadiness that surprised even him, eyes scanning the brush and hollows the way he had in younger days when survival was not a choice but a way of life. His boots sank into the muck, his breath ghosting before him, and his knife felt right again in his hand. It didn't take long. A flash of movement in the grass caught his eye, a rabbit, scrawny from winter but meat nonetheless. Jesse crouched low, patience settling into him like an old companion. The animal paused, ears twitching, and in that heartbeat, Jesse let fly. The knife spun once, then buried itself true. He reached the spot and lifted the limp body, a grim satisfaction pulling at the corner of his mouth. For the first time in days, he had food worth eating. Back at the shack, he found the saddlebag he had dropped in the night. From its depths, he dug out a small pouch of cornmeal, damp from rain but not spoiled beyond use. It wasn't much, but with fire and a little effort, it could stretch. He cleaned and dressed the rabbit with quick, efficient strokes, the blood steaming in the cold air, and set the meat to cook over the rekindled fire. The smell filled the ruined shack, rich and wild, making Eli's eyes widen and Ruthie's small hand reach weakly toward the flames as if she could grab it from the air. They ate like wolves, tearing at the meat and gulping down the mush Jessie scraped together from the soggy meal. Anna made them slow as best she could, but her own hands trembled as she lifted her share to her lips. Hunger silenced doubt, if only for a while. Jesse sat back and watched them, his own stomach twisting but not from want of food. He let them eat their fill first, chewing only on the scraps left behind. Anna's eyes found him through the flicker of the fire. There was suspicion still, yes, but also something harder to name. Jesse Coulter, the drunk who wasted his life in saloons, had moved through the morning with the instinct of a man who had once known how to live hard and endure worse. The mask he wore for the world, the shambling, half-broken fool, had slipped in the light of necessity. Beneath it was someone who remembered survival, who knew how to keep children alive in a land that cared nothing for them. As Ruthie finally drifted into sleep with a full belly, Jesse leaned back against the wall, his eyes on the low flames. He felt the old rhythms stirring, muscles remembering, hands steady in ways they had not been in years. For the first time in a long while, he was not merely surviving for himself. He was keeping others alive, and that weight settled heavy on him. Yet, in that weight, he found something that almost felt like purpose. Night settled heavy over the plains, softer than the storm but no less suffocating. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, the kind that whispered against the broken roof of the shack and trickled down its warped boards. A thin fire burned in the hearth, its glow flickering across the faces gathered close. The children lay curled together on a nest of damp blankets Jesse had dug from his saddlebag, their small chests rising and falling in fitful sleep. Eli muttered something in his dreams. Ruthie pressed her thumb to her mouth, and both looked far too fragile for a world that had given them so little. Anna sat near them, her eyes fixed on Jesse. She had been watching him all evening quietly, carefully, as if measuring whether the man across from her was made of anything more than whiskey fumes and false promises. She could not understand him. Why had he stopped? Why had he carried them to this ruin instead of stumbling past into the night, as any other drunk might have done? The question weighed on her until she finally spoke. Why help us at all? Her voice was low, cautious, but sharp with the edge of disbelief. You could have walked on. Most would have. Jesse's jaw tightened. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. He kept his gaze on the flames, refusing to meet her eyes. Maybe I should have, he muttered, the words rough and flat. That isn't an answer, she pressed, her tone softening but no less steady. Not one that makes sense, anyway. He sat in silence for a long while, shoulders hunched, shadowed by the firelight. The crackle of wood filled the space between them, and outside the rain tapped a hollow rhythm on the roof. Finally, with a long, ragged breath, Jesse spoke. I had a family once. His voice was quieter now, stripped of the bravado that usually covered the smell of liquor. A wife. And a baby girl. Didn't keep her but a week before fever took her. My wife followed her into the ground not long after, buried them side by side, out past the ridge where the cottonwoods grow. Thought I'd die there with 'em, truth be told. But I didn't. I lived. And I hated myself for it. Anna's eyes softened, though she said nothing. She watched his hands as they gripped the stick, knuckles white, the firelight catching the faint tremor in his fingers. I tried to drink it away, he continued, each word like gravel in his throat. Whiskey was easier than remembering, easier than hearing my little girl's cry in the dark when I closed my eyes. Been stumbling from one saloon to the next ever since, wasting what was left of me. Folks say I'm good for nothing, and most days I reckon they're right. The fire popped, casting sparks that danced briefly before fading into ash. Jesse stared into it as if it were the only thing keeping him from unraveling completely. But tonight, hearing your young ones laugh, even with their bellies empty, even half frozen, that sound, his voice caught, and he pressed a hand to his face, as if to hide the crack in it. It cut me like a knife, hurt worse than any hangover I ever had, but it reminded me of what I lost, reminded me that once, I knew what it was to care about something other than a bottle. For the first time since she'd met him, Anna saw the drunkard's mask slip away entirely. What sat across from her was not a failure propped up by whiskey, but a man hollowed out by grief, still carrying the weight of it after all these years. Anna drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her gaze softening. "Then maybe," she said quietly, "you haven't wasted as much as you think. You're here now. That counts for something." Jesse looked at her then, finally, his eyes glistening in the firelight. He held her gaze for a moment, long enough for her to see the raw pain, but also the faint flicker of something buried deep beneath it. Not redemption, not yet, but the first stirring of it, fragile as the flame between them. Outside, the storm drifted further into the distance, leaving behind only the sound of dripping eaves and the soft breath of children who, for one night at least, had survived. And in that small shack, Jesse Coulter allowed himself to remember what it felt like to care, and the memory burned sharper than the whiskey he once thought was his only comfort. By morning, the sky had cleared, washed clean by the storm, the prairie stretching wide and glistening under the pale light. Puddles shimmered in the grass, the air sharp with the smell of wet earth. For the first time in days, the sun pushed its way through the clouds, but its warmth did little to chase away the chill that clung inside the shack. Jesse crouched near the hearth, coaxing another flame from the last of the dry wood, while Anna gathered Eli and Ruthie closer, letting their small hands warm against the heat. The moment was fragile, a thin layer of peace after a night spent listening to rain pound on the roof. It didn't last. Jesse's ears caught it first, the faint thud of hooves against the softened earth, muffled but unmistakable. He stiffened, every muscle in his body tightening like a rope pulled too taut. He moved to the broken doorway and looked out. On the ridge beyond the grove, dark silhouettes moved against the horizon. Riders, 4 of them at least, their horses slow and deliberate, eyes fixed on the thin curl of smoke rising from the shack's chimney. He cursed under his breath and stepped back inside. "Keep the young ones quiet," he whispered, voice rough but urgent. His hand shook as he pulled the revolver from his belt, but the movement was automatic, the rhythm of it long ingrained. He broke the chamber, checked the rounds, 6 shots. It wasn't much if things turned ugly, but it was something. He thumbed each cartridge, the faint click of metal loud in the tense silence. Anna's eyes followed him, her body tensed like a cornered deer. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Calloway's gang," Jesse said, eyes never leaving the doorway. "Scavengers, wolves dressed as men. They'll see a woman, 2 children, and a shack in the middle of nowhere. That's blood in the water to men like them." Fear flickered across Anna's face, but she clutched her children tighter, her jaw setting firm. Jesse saw it out of the corner of his eye, that flash of steel beneath the fear, and for a moment, it steadied his own hand. The riders began circling closer, fanning out across the ridge in a loose arc. Jesse knew the tactic well: keep the prey hemmed in, cut off escape before showing teeth. He had ridden like that once, before the bottle dulled his edges, before he lost himself in the bottom of a glass. He had known men like these, had laughed beside them when they took what wasn't theirs, had shared the spoils and the shame. The memory made his gut twist, but it also sharpened his mind. He recognized the way they moved, the deliberate patience. Wolves, yes. and he had been one of them once. That was how he knew exactly what they were about to do. He crouched by the window, keeping low, revolver resting steady on the sill. His hand trembled, but when his finger curled around the grip, it was steadier than he expected. "Stay behind me," he muttered to Anna without turning. "No matter what happens, keep the little ones down and quiet." The riders drew nearer, close enough now that Jesse could make out the cut of their coats, the rifles slung across their saddles. One of them spat into the dirt, laughing at some unseen joke. They hadn't seen Jesse yet, not clearly, but they knew someone was here. The smoke had told them as much. He took a breath, slow and deep, steadying himself against the tide of panic that pressed in. The bottle might have hollowed him out, but it hadn't erased the instincts carved into him by years of hard living. He could still see wolves for what they were, and he knew the only way to deal with wolves was to show teeth of your own. As the gang closed in, the shack seemed smaller, its thin walls weaker, the children's breaths louder than gunfire. Jesse tightened his grip on the revolver and set his jaw. He was half drunk, half broken, but not blind. Not yet. And if these men wanted to test him, they would learn there was still fight left in Jesse Coulter. The riders came down off the ridge like shadows peeled from the horizon, 4 horses kicking mud with every stride. Their laughter carried before them, rough and mean, the sound of men who had spent their lives preying on weakness. By the time they pulled up in front of the shack, the sun was low enough to burn the sky in blood-red streaks, and the light caught their faces just enough for Jesse to know he was right. Calloway's men. Wolves with spurs. They sat easy in their saddles, rifles resting across their thighs, confidence radiating from every sneer. One of them leaned forward in his stirrups, spit dark juice into the mud, and called out with mock politeness, "Evenin', friend. Mighty cozy little fire you've got going. Be a shame not to share." The others laughed, eyes narrowing on the doorway where Jesse stood. He knew what they saw. A man with bloodshot eyes, swaying on his feet, hat pulled low against the wind. A drunk, a fool. A stumbling shell who wasn't worth the trouble it would take to kill him. Jesse let them believe it. For once in his life, he used the stink of whiskey as a mask. "You'll find no welcome here," he said, his words roughened by years of drink but steady enough to carry. "Keep ridin'." The leader, a broad man with a scar across his jaw, grinned. "Or what? You'll fall over at us? Come now, Coulter. Everybody knows you ain't got fight left in you." His tone dripped with contempt. He shifted in his saddle, hand brushing the grip of his pistol as if daring Jesse to twitch. Behind Jesse, Anna pressed the children into the corner, her arms like iron around them. Eli's eyes were wide, Ruthie's soft whimper muffled against her mother's dress. The room seemed to hold its breath. Jesse's hand hovered low, inches from the revolver at his hip. The world slowed, the way it always had in moments like this, back when he'd lived by the gun. He could hear the horses breathing, the leather creak of saddles, the faint crackle of the fire behind him. The scarred man's grin widened, certain he'd already won. Then Jesse moved. The revolver cleared leather in a blur, faster than the eye could follow. The crack of the shot tore the quiet wide open, and the leader's hat flew clean off his head, spinning into the mud. The man froze, disbelief painted across his face, his hand stopped halfway to his gun. The other riders jerked back in their saddles, startled yells cutting the air. For 3 long heartbeats no one moved, then the spell broke. The gang scattered, spurring their horses hard, pulling back into the gathering dusk. They shouted curses over their shoulders, promising they'd be back with more men, with fire, with blood. Their hoofbeats faded into the distance, swallowed by the open plains, but their threats lingered like a storm cloud. Jesse lowered the revolver slowly, the weight of it familiar, steady in his hand. His chest heaved, not from fear but from the rush of something he thought he'd buried long ago. He turned and found Anna staring at him, her eyes wide, not with terror, but with shock. She had seen the stumble in his walk, the slur in his speech, the stink of whiskey that clung to him like sweat. Yet in that instant, she had also seen a man whose reflexes had not rusted, whose skill was still sharp enough to slice through the arrogance of armed men. "You," she began, then stopped, as if the words failed her. Jesse holstered the revolver, exhaling slow. "I told you," he said quietly. "I know wolves when I see 'em." The shack fell silent again, the fire snapping softly in the hearth. Outside, the wind had stilled, but the threat of return lingered heavy in the air. Inside, Anna held her children tighter, her eyes still fixed on Jesse Coulter. For the first time, she saw more than the drunk who had stumbled out of the rain. She saw the gunman he used to be and maybe, just maybe, still was. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, faint orange glows that pulsed like the last heartbeat of the shack. Jesse stood at the doorway, eyes on the horizon where the gang had disappeared hours earlier. The night was quiet again, but it wasn't peace, only the heavy silence that comes when predators are circling just out of sight. He had lived long enough in the company of wolves to know they would be back. Men like Calloway's crew never let a bruise go unavenged. They would come with more horses, more guns, and they would not leave until every living soul inside that shack was dead or broken. He turned back into the room. Anna sat with her children pressed against her sides, their small bodies finally heavy with exhaustion. Ruthie's head lolled against her mother's shoulder, her lips parted in shallow sleep. Eli fought harder against it, his jaw tight, his eyes half open as if he could guard them all by sheer will. Anna's gaze met Jesse's, and in it he saw the weight of a woman who had carried too much for too long. She didn't have to speak for him to hear the question there. What now? Jesse didn't answer her with words. He crossed to the corner where his saddle lay, lifted it with a grunt, and stepped outside. The air was sharp and wet, the ground still soft beneath his boots. His mare stood in the corral, ribs showing faintly under her damp coat, but her eyes bright with stubborn fire. She had carried him through worse than this, and he trusted her the way a man trusted an old partner who had never betrayed him. He ran a hand down her flank, murmuring low, and she nickered softly as he slung the saddle over her back. Inside, Anna had risen, watching through the open door. "Where would we even go?" she asked finally, her voice hard with suspicion. "The town doesn't want us. The storm's still out there. And you—" She broke off, her jaw tightening. "You've lived your life chasing a bottle. Why should I believe following you won't end the same way, in ruin?" Jesse cinched the saddle tight, his hands moving steady despite the tremor in them. He didn't argue. He didn't have the words to undo the years of failure trailing behind him like chains. Instead, he crouched down in front of the children, meeting Eli's wary eyes first. The boy looked at him like one man sizes another, measuring the strength in him. Jesse swallowed hard, his voice coming rough but clear. "I won't let you die out here. Not in the rain, not with wolves circling." His gaze softened as it slid to Ruthie, still half asleep against her mother. "I swear it. By all that's left in me, I'll keep you safe." The words shook out of him. Unsteady but true, pulled from a place so deep he barely remembered it existed. And something in the way he said them, something stripped of whiskey and bravado, made the air shift. Eli's jaw eased, Ruthie stirred and nestled closer to her mother, and Anna's eyes lingered on Jesse, longer than before. She saw the ruin still, but also a glimmer of the man he must have been once, before the bottle hollowed him. For a long moment, she stood frozen, her arms around her children as if her grip alone could anchor them in the world. Then she exhaled, a sound half sigh, half defeat, and lifted them both toward the horse. Jesse steadied the mare as Eli scrambled up, pulling Ruthie into his lap. Anna followed, her movements tense, uncertain, but she mounted behind them. Her hand brushed Jesse's as she swung up, and instead of pulling away, she gripped it, strong and deliberate. Their eyes met. The wind whistled through the broken walls of the shack, carrying the promise of danger that would come with daylight. But for that moment, with her hand in his, Jesse felt something he had thought buried for good. Trust. Fragile, uncertain, but real. He nodded once, then turned his mare toward the open land. The shack, the storm, the failures of the past, all of it fell behind them as they rode into the night, carrying more than just the weight of survival. The trail to town cut through a narrow gulch, its walls rising in jagged slopes of rock and scrub that funneled the riders into a thin line. The morning sun hung pale and cold, the air damp with the memory of the storm. Jesse led his mare at a steady pace, his eyes flicking to every shadow along the ridge. Anna rode behind him with the children, Ruthie pressed against her chest and Eli clinging to the saddle horn. The silence of the land should have been comforting, but instead it pressed heavy, like the breath of something waiting. The ambush came swift. A whistle echoed from the ridge, sharp and mocking, and then the Callaway riders spilled into the gulch from both ends. Their horses thundered down the slopes, dust rising behind them. Jesse's gut clenched. He knew this ground, it was a killing box. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and hemmed in with no clear way out. "Off the horse," Jesse barked, his voice sharp as a whip crack. He swung down, pulling Anna with him and shoving her and the children toward a scatter of rocks near the gulch wall. "Stay low. Don't move unless I tell you." Anna's eyes were wide, fear and disbelief warring inside her, but she obeyed. She pulled Eli and Ruthie down into the dust, wrapping her arms around them. Jesse turned back, revolver already in his hand, his body settling into a stance he hadn't worn in years. The first shot split the air, ricocheting off stone near his head. Jesse didn't flinch. He raised his revolver and fired once, clean and precise, dropping the rider who had thought to rush him from the front. Another came on fast, swinging his rifle like a club, and Jesse's second bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him off his horse. The gulch erupted with gunfire. Bullets screamed off the rocks, horses shrieked, and the air filled with dust and smoke. Jesse moved like a man possessed, his unsteady legs braced against the earth, his arms steady in spite of the tremor in his blood. Every shot counted, no wild firing, no wasted lead. He fought as he once had, in a time when his life had meant something more than the bottom of a bottle. But the years had left their mark. A bullet tore across his side, hot pain blooming under his ribs. Another grazed his arm, blood soaking his sleeve. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay upright, forcing his body to obey. He had promised those children they would not die in the rain, and by God, he would not let his promise break here in the dust. The Callaways pressed harder, circling, firing, shouting curses. Jesse's revolver barked until the chamber clicked empty, smoke curling from the barrel. He dropped to one knee, breath ragged, blood dark on his shirt. He braced for the rush that would finish him. Then, from beyond the ridge, came the sound of more horses. Shouts carried on the wind not the wild cries of raiders, but the disciplined calls of men in formation. The town posse, drawn by the echo of gunfire, charged into the gulch with rifles raised. The Callaways broke at the sight of them, scattering back into the hills in a storm of dust and curses. Jesse swayed, the revolver slipping from his hand, its chambers spent. He caught one last glimpse of Anna rushing toward him, Eli at her side, Ruthie calling his name with a cry that cut through the chaos. Then the world tilted, the noise of battle fading. He collapsed into the dirt, blood soaking the earth beneath him, the empty revolver lying by his hand like the end of a prayer. Jesse came back to himself slowly, as if surfacing through layers of dark water. The first thing he noticed was the smell, not the reek of whiskey, or the damp rot of a shack, but the sharp, clean scent of soap and linen. Beneath him, a mattress gave under his weight, softer than anything he had laid on in years. He blinked against the light filtering through white curtains and realized, with a start, that he was in a real bed. His body ached everywhere, ribs bound, side heavy with stitches. When he shifted, a low groan escaped his throat. The sound stirred someone nearby. Anna sat in a chair close to him, her head lifting as though she had been watching him for hours. Behind her, Eli and Ruthie slept curled together on a small cot, their faces peaceful in the pale morning light. For a moment, Jessie thought he was still dreaming. "You're awake," Anna said softly. Her voice carried something he hadn't heard before. Not suspicion, not disbelief, but relief. "You gave us quite a scare." Jesse licked his cracked lips, the dryness of his throat sharper than any hangover he could remember. "How long?" he rasped. 3 days. Anna leaned forward, pouring water from a pitcher and holding the cup to his lips. He drank greedily, the coolness cutting through the fog. She watched him carefully, her expression unreadable. "The doctor says you'll live. Barely. You lost a lot of blood in that gulch." He let his head sink back, staring at the ceiling beams overhead. A strange stillness filled him. For the first time in years, his mind wasn't clouded with the fog of drink. The dull ache of craving wasn't there. Instead, there was only exhaustion, clarity, and a strange, quiet sense of peace. Anna's hand brushed over Ruthie's hair as the girl stirred in her sleep. "The town's been talking," she said after a pause. "They don't speak of you as the drunk anymore. They call you the man who stood down Calloway's gang, the man who saved a mother and her children when no one else would." Her gaze returned to him, steady and searching. "They see you differently now. I think maybe you see yourself differently too." Jesse didn't answer right away. He let her words settle, heavy as stones but warm in a way he hadn't expected. His whole life, his name had been muttered with disdain, spit out alongside curses and pity. To hear that it was spoken with respect, even gratitude, it pressed on something deep in him, something he thought was long dead. Later that morning, the sheriff himself stopped by. A tall man with weathered eyes, he stood at the foot of the bed and looked Jesse over. "Town owes you," he said plainly. "We've got work for a man with steady aim and a backbone. Guard duty, escort jobs, honest wages if you want 'em." Jesse studied him, then glanced toward Anna and the children. Eli had woken and was watching him quietly, his eyes holding something like trust. Ruthie's small fingers clung to her mother's sleeve, her sleepy smile brighter than any sunrise. Jesse felt something stir in his chest, something stronger than thirst, stronger than fear, a reason. He nodded slowly. "Reckon I'll take it." When the sheriff left, Jesse eased himself upright, grimacing at the pain but refusing to lie back down. Anna started to protest, but he only shook his head and turned toward the window. Outside, the storm clouds that had ruled the skies for days were breaking apart, sunlight spilling through in bold golden strokes. The land glistened, fresh and alive, as if the whole world had been washed clean. He sat there a long while, breathing it in. The bottle had owned him for years, dragging him through gutters and dust. But in this moment, sober and battered, Jesse Coulter felt more alive than he ever had at the bottom of a glass. He had stood in the rain, stood against wolves, and lived long enough to see dawn again. The drunk who had stumbled out of the storm was gone. In his place was a man who had found something worth standing for, worth fighting for. He had given others the chance to see the dawn, and in doing so, he had finally seen it himself.